The 9,692nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Yemen to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Hans Grunberg, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, and Joyce Masuya, Acting Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Grunberg.
My apologies for keeping you waiting, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I brief you today, the trajectory of the development in Yemen has since the beginning of the year moved in the wrong direction, and if left unaddressed, could reach a tipping point. The regional dimension of the conflict in Yemen is getting more and more pronounced. Escalation in the economic sphere has been translating into public threats to return to full-fledged war. Ansar Allah is escalating its crackdown on the civic space and on international organizations. While the parties have displayed willingness to engage in dialogue on the economic sphere, which I welcome, I reiterate my warning to the Council that we risk a return to full-scale war and all the predictable human suffering and regional implications this entails. We have a common interest and a responsibility to avoid this. Mr. President, it has been almost 7 weeks since Ansar Allah arbitrarily detained 13 UN colleagues and dozens of personnel of international and national organizations, civil society and private sector entities, many of whom support the work of the United Nations. Among those who were arbitrarily detained, there are at least 4 women. From my contact with family members, I know they are frightened about the fate of their mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, sisters, and brothers who are currently detained. Nearly 2 months have passed without knowing where they are and under what conditions they are being held. Nearly 2 months, and we have not heard from any of them. 4 other personnel from OHCHR and UNESCO have been held even longer, since 2021 and 2023 respectively. Let me be clear, all the detained personnel are people who, day in and out, work for their country, for Yemen. They provide humanitarian assistance to those in need. They protect the heritage of the country. They work on mediation, development, the promotion of human rights, and peace building. If it were not for these staff members and their organizations, the effects of the war on Yemen's population would have been even worse. Therefore, I repeat my earlier demand to Ansar Allah to immediately and unconditionally release them and refrain from detaining any additional UN, NGO, and civil society staff members. Mr. President, 7 months of an escalatory trajectory reached a new and dangerous level last week. I am deeply concerned by the recent military activities in the region, including a drone attack on Tel Aviv by Ansar Allah on 19th of July, and the subsequent Israeli retaliatory attacks on Hodeidah port and its oil and power facilities on the 20th of July. I remain deeply concerned about the continued targeting of international navigation in the Red Sea and its surrounding waterways. Recent developments suggest that the threat against international shipping is increasing in scope and precision. Commercial shipping vessels have been sunk and damaged, civilians have been killed, the crew of the Galaxy Leader remains arbitrarily detained, and international trade has been disrupted. Meanwhile, the US and the UK have continued to carry out strikes on military targets in the Ansar Allah-controlled territory.
I'm talking to y'all. When people just calling me dumb and stupid. Okay, thank you. We got a YouTube channel now. Call me something else.
These latest developments show the new danger of a devastating regional escalation. Mr. President, the situation along the front lines also remains a source of concern. Over the past months, we have witnessed an increase in military preparation and reinforcements. This month, clashes have been reported along numerous front lines, including Al-Dale, Al-Hodeidah, Lahej, Ma'rib, Saada, and Taiz. While the levels of violence have been relatively contained compared to the period before the 2022 truce, the recent trend of escalation, accompanied by continuous threats of a full-scale return to war, demonstrates how volatile the situation is. Mr. President, while I am concerned about the overall trajectory that Yemen is on, I am nonetheless encouraged by that last night the parties informed me that they have agreed on a path to de-escalate a cycle of measures and countermeasures which has sought to tighten their grip on the banking and transport sectors. This understanding follows months of intense engagement from my office to seek solutions and warn against the serious risk to the Yemeni people that these deepening weaponization of the economy would have posed. I welcome the parties' decision to choose a path of dialogue, and I look forward to engaging further with the parties to support them in implementing their commitments with regard to the banking sector and Yemeni airways. The aim remains a unified currency, a unified independent central bank, and a banking sector free of political interference. I would also like to recognize the role that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has played in reaching this understanding. However, I can and will caution that we have been here before and that parties have a choice to make. There are underlying issues to be addressed. Stopgap measures might serve as band-aid, but will not provide for sustainable solutions, nor will they reasonably pave the way for nationwide ceasefire and a political process without sustained dialogue. The parties' commitments to de-escalation and dialogue, as reflected in the understanding they reached last night and the broader understanding they reached last December, must translate into readiness to negotiate directly. Engaging in good faith dialogue is the minimum requirement to meet their responsibilities to the Yemeni people and a real test of their genuine intention to follow a path of peaceful conflict resolution. Mr. President, while my UN colleagues and I continue our tireless efforts towards the release of our personnel and the aids and civil society workers, we are also determined to see the release of the thousands of conflict-related detainees. They have been waiting years to be reunited with their families. Therefore, I consider it as a positive sign that the parties met and discussed in Oman, under the auspices of the United Nations and the ICRC, the release of conflict-related detainees on the basis of the all-for-all principle as agreed in Stockholm in 2018. The meeting made substantial progress, but unfortunately not yet on an agreement for an all-for-all release. Our efforts in this regard will continue, and I would like to thank the Sultanate of Oman for hosting the meeting as part of their valuable support to my mediation efforts. Mr. President, I am tasked by this Council to support the resumption of a peaceful, inclusive, orderly and Yemeni-led political transition process that meets the legitimate demands and aspirations of the Yemeni people. Yemenis demand peace. They demand economic prosperity. They demand basic services. They demand good governance. And they demand justice and reconciliation. But as of late, rather than being able to focus on finding a sustainable and just solution for the benefit of all Yemenis, the situation has forced me to focus on the short term. New issues are constantly arising, and hence considerable efforts go into convincing the parties to either refrain from implementing escalatory measures or, as a consequence of escalatory measures, to return to the status quo ante. The challenges I have outlined today make it all the more clear that the only way to move forward in Yemen is to find mutually acceptable solutions through dialogue and negotiation. The alternative is more fragmentation and more suffering. My office and I will remain as determined as ever to continue to assist, encourage, and provide every opportunity for the parties to find solutions through dialogue. But ultimately, this choice is theirs. Beyond echoing the Secretary General's recent call for utmost restraint with regards to Yemen, I urge the parties to engage in good faith with my office and to engage on a long-term approach to de-escalate and to prioritize the well-being of Yemenis. This will allow us to preserve the space necessary to continue the work towards a nationwide ceasefire and the resumption of a political process as part of the previously agreed commitments to be operationalized in a UN roadmap. Mr. President, I continue to depend on the Council's full support in all of these efforts. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Grunberg for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Ms. Joyce Masuya.
Thank you, Mr. President. And allow me to thank Special Envoy Grunberg for his update. I take particular note of progress in de-escalating measures on the banking front and on reinitiating work towards a roadmap under United Nations auspices. This comes at a critical time. Mr. President, we are very concerned about other events that have unfolded over recent days, including Houthi attacks on Tel Aviv and the subsequent Israeli strikes on Hodeidah. These developments further increase risks of a regional spillover and a return to full-scale conflict in Yemen.
Speaker, thank you very much indeed. I believe it's customary in a maiden speech
to avoid attacks that could harm civilians and damage civilian infrastructure. Following the strikes on Hodeidah on Saturday, the Houthi de facto Ministry of Health reported 9 deaths and 83 people with injuries, including some with severe burns. No humanitarian workers were among the casualties. As Council members heard yesterday, the full impacts on the functioning of Hodeidah port are not yet clear. We are, however, aware of reports of damage to port infrastructure. The port is a lifeline for millions of people across Yemen. Much of Yemen's basic items are imported, including up to 85% of its food supplies. The majority of these imports arrive through Hodeidah. There are no viable alternatives to receive commercial imports at scale. Hodeidah port must remain open and operating. Infrastructure that plays such an indispensable role must be spared. Mr. President, I would like to address broader threats to the safety and security
well,
of
I'm 12 days into this job, and I've got to say last night was an amazing moment. At 8 o'clock, we got the Times, you got poll, putting us ahead of the Conservative Party. The inflection point, and believe me, the other pollsters will catch up with us over the next few days. I've noticed over the last few weeks momentum building around the country, and it's kind of why I felt I had to come back. I knew something was happening out there, and I couldn't just let down millions of people who've supported me over many, many years, and I think millions more who may well come to reform over the course of the next 3 weeks. So to go ahead of the Tories, be second in the polls, is pretty amazing. On the back of that, I've done a press conference today with reviewers of the BBC demanding that we are now included in the other main leaders' debates, not the 7-way ones that I've been part of so far with Clyde, SNP, which of course isn't relevant to people voting across the whole of England. The debate itself was fascinating. Penny Mordaunt just in terrible trouble and coming out with the old line. A vote for reform is a vote for Labour. No! We're well ahead of the Conservatives in all of the red wall seats. We're well ahead of the Conservatives in the Midlands and the North. We're well ahead of the Conservatives in quite a few of the seats in Eastern region, and we're growing all the time. So actually, the message here now is in many seats in this country, it's a Conservative vote that is a wasted vote. It's a Conservative vote that will let Labour in. I'm going to launch a manifesto. I won't call it manifesto. I know what you're thinking. Manifesto equals lie. That's the word association. We're going to call it a contract with the people. These are the things that we're going to be campaigning on. It will be launched in the valleys of South Wales on Monday morning. Why there, you ask? Because Labour are in charge of Wales. Education doing badly. Health far worse than the rest of the country. Loop 20-mile-an-hour speed limits right across the Principality. So that's the reason we're going to go there. And I want next week to start taking on the Labour Party as well. Because, you know, Keir Starmer launched his manifesto, 6 key pledges, no mention of illegal immigration, let alone legal immigration. And I do believe that it is the population crisis, the population explosion, that is causing the problem. It's causing a problem with people's cost of living, rents, availability, affordability of housing, access to GPs, increased waiting lists, traffic beyond our worst nightmares, infrastructure that can't cope, whichever way you look at it. Mass unskilled immigration is making us poorer, not working for our country. And I believe this really should be the immigration election. But the others, well, Labour would rather not talk about it. And the Tories pretend to cut immigration, really. 2010, 2015, 2017, 2019, 4 manifestos promising reductions to tens of thousands a year for net migration. Big reductions now we've got back control after Brexit. And it's been running for the last couple of years. Net, let alone gross, net migration at 750,000 a year. The figures are completely beyond belief. This campaign's going well. We've got momentum, but now we're into second place and really challenging seriously to win seats, maybe quite a lot of seats. Believe you me, the establishment will now come after us. And what I need is the ammunition to fight back. Yes, we've raised money. Yes, we're doing well. We're closing in now on 50,000 paid-up members. That's almost double over the course of the last 12 days. All of that is great. Some bigger donations coming in too. But I need the ammunition to fight back. I need the ammunition to mount big advertising campaigns, both conventionally and, of course, online too. So, folks, if you're behind me, if you support what we're trying to do, whatever age you are, however much money you've got available or not, I need ammunition. I need your support. I need you to go and talk to people, encourage family, friends to vote reform. If you want real change, don't vote for the same old parties. So please, go to reformparty.uk. Join us. It's 25 quid. If you don't want to join us, please give us a donation, however big or small suits you. Reformparty.uk. I need ammo. Without you, I can't get it. This is a revolt against the establishment. Help me. Join the revolt. That way we will get real change and try to get our country back on track. As you know, as well as I do, everything at the moment is not working. Britain is broken. Britain needs reform. Please help me. Reformparty.uk is where you do it.
Many hundreds more people will come to our
and an
country.
average
And
just
nobody is making the
2.8
argument
million
that
people
there aren't some
each
exceptionally
month
wonderful
received
people among
food
them. There are,
assistance
of course.
out of the 12.8
But the sheer
million
level
targeted.
of population means we
Even
have to build
those
a new house
that we are able to
every
reach
2
are
minutes.
being affected
Even
by
if the Labour
underfunding.
government
Many are
is
having
able
to
to
make
fulfil
do
the 1.5
with reduced
million
rations,
houses
around
that it wants to build
40%
during
of
the
what
lifetime
we
of this
need.
Parliament.
As a matter of urgency, I once again urge donors to step forward with additional funding for these critical programs.
Since 2021.
Mr. President,
population increase
ultimately the stabilization
and the list
of food
goes on
insecurity
through access
and
to health
malnutrition
services,
rates in
to
Yemen
congestion,
and
to
an
pressure on
improvement in
infrastructure.
humanitarian
The population
conditions
crisis
across
is
the
the
board
biggest impact,
depend
affecting
on
people's
a
lives,
manifest
damaging their
improvement
quality
in
of
the
life,
economic
and virtually
situation.
nobody in
Over
this
the
place
course of the
even
conflict,
wants
Yemen's
to talk about
GDP
it.
has
But perhaps
shrunk
it's on
by
illegal
more than half.
immigration that I
And
do really want
recent
to make
analysis
a
by the
point.
World Bank
4
has
years
found
ago,
that GDP
I went out
contracted even
into the
further
English
in
Channel
the last
repeatedly,
year.
filming
The value of the
dinghies
real in
coming across the
government-held
channel,
areas
dinghies with an average
has continued
of
to
16
fall
people
to
per
record
boat.
lows,
I was
recently
described as
reaching
being
more than
a sad, lonely, desperate figure,
1,800 reals to the US
always
dollar.
seeking attention.
This has driven already
And I've no doubt there are some
sky-high
that think
food
that's still the
prices
case
even further
today.
out of reach for millions of people.
Thank you.
The cost of the minimum
But I
food
did it
basket
because
in
it was obvious to
government-controlled
me what was
areas
going to happen.
is the highest
It was
it
obvious
has
that
ever
there
been.
would be
citizens
a
It
huge
is in
influx
this
of people
context
illegally
that
in and
today's
Britain,
announcement by the
across
Special
the spectrum,
Envoy
and it would happen
measures to
because
bring the
a
parties
rejoice we
together on
stopped
economic
deporting
and other
people
issues
who
is
came
even
the
more
rest of Britain,
important.
and it's very interesting
I
as we debate
urge
the
the
King's
parties
Speech. The Labour
to
Party, if you
seize
look, might
this
want to
great
reflect the
opportunity
speech itself
to find
on
sustainable
the last period
solutions
of
to
Labour
these
government,
challenges.
where we had
Millions
Home
of people
Secretaries
across the
like
country
David Blunkett,
depend on
asylum,
it.
just
Mr. President,
far to
the
their right,
humanitarian
by a Conservative
community
of people
is
like the
committed
Shadow,
to
despite
staying
Home
and
Secretary
delivering in
today.
Yemen
Do it, but I
as
will.
best
You
as
came
it
to Britain
can
illegally
for as long
to
as
make
it
during the
takes.
last Labour government. No, it's funny because
Amid
your feet
growing
didn't touch the side. You were gone.
an
You were out.
escalating threat
Indeed, in the
environment
last
and
year
shrinking
of the Labour
humanitarian
government,
operating
from
space,
2009 to
this
10,
work is becoming much more
50,000
difficult.
people
I
who came here
urge
illegally
this Council
were
to do
deported.
everything in its power to
Now, none of that
maintain
happens
unity,
anymore. It didn't
de-escalate
happen under 14
rising
years of
tensions,
Conservatives,
and
and it
support the
clearly isn't going to
humanitarian
happen
response in
under
Yemen.
this Labour
Thank you.
government. And I wonder why. I think you'll find it's the increased role
Madam
of a court
Masuya for a briefing,
overseas
and I
that
now
was
give
set
the
up
floor
in
to
the
those
wake of
council
World War
members who
II
wish to make
with the very,
statements.
very best of
And
intentions
I give the
that
floor
has
to the United
now
Kingdom.
completely
Thank you,
outlived its
President.
usefulness.
And I thank
It is, of
Special
course,
Envoy,
called the
Grunberg and
ECHR,
Acting Under
the
Secretary
European
General
Court
Masuya
of Human
for
Rights.
your briefings.
And it was the Labour government that
I'll make,
enshrined
3
the
points.
Convention into British
First,
law. We will
we call on the
not
Houthis
stop
to stop
the boats,
their escalatory behaviour
even if we send a
that
handful to
threatens the
Rwanda.
prospect of
We will
stability
not
in
stop
Yemen
the boats
and the
by
region.
attempting to smash the
We
criminal
once again
gangs. We've been doing
condemn
that
the Houthi
to the drugs
attack on
industry in
Tel Aviv,
Britain year
which
after
saw
year,
an Israeli
decade
citizen,
after decade,
an Israeli
with no
civilian killed,
success
and
whatsoever.
10 other civilians
The financial
wounded.
rewards for smuggling people across the
We are
English
deeply
Channel
concerned
can now
about
net
the risk
a gang
and the
2
consequences
to 3
of
million
escalation in the
euros
region.
a week.
And we call
Whatever
for
prison
all
sentences or
parties
penalties
to
are put upon
exercise
them, there will
restraint.
always be people volunteering
We also
to make
remain
millions
deeply
of
concerned
euros a week.
by the Houthis'
We will
detention
only
of
stop
United
this
Nations
if we
personnel,
start deporting people
as well
that
as
come
the staff and former staff of non-governmental organisations and diplomatic missions. We echo the calls from Special Envoy Grunberg and Acting Under Secretary General Masuya on the Houthis to immediately and unconditionally release those held, as well as the personal distress for the individuals and their families. These detentions have also severely impeded the delivery of vital aid to those most in need and further constrained the humanitarian community working across Yemen. All humanitarian, UN and diplomatic staff should be free to operate safely and securely throughout Yemen. Second, the UK has been clear that the continued flouting of the arms embargo under UNSCR 2216 is unacceptable and serves only to fuel further regional tensions. The increasing reports of ships entering Hodeidah without reporting to UNVIM for inspection is deeply worrying, because the inspection of vessels is fundamental to stopping illicit arms entering Houthi-controlled areas, while also ensuring the import of commercial goods. We must continue to provide unwavering support to UNVIM and ensure it has the necessary funding to stop the smuggling of illicit arms. Finally, we welcome the commitment of the parties to de-escalate economic tensions and to start convening meetings to discuss all economic and humanitarian issues based on the roadmap. The UK reaffirms that the only way to peace in Yemen is through dialogue and engagement with the Special Envoy. It is important that we remain unified in support of his efforts to secure an inclusive and sustainable peace in Yemen. We continue to urge all parties to de-escalate tensions and preserve space for negotiations. I thank you.
I thank the United Kingdom for your statement, and I now give the floor to Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver the statement on behalf of the A3+, namely Algeria, Guyana, Mozambique, and my country, Sierra Leone. The A3+ thanks Special Envoy Mr. Hans Grunberg and Acting USG Ms. Joyce Musoya for their comprehensive updates and valuable insight on the security and humanitarian situation in Yemen. We also welcome the participation of the representative of Yemen in this meeting. Mr. President, at the outset, the A3+ welcomes a report of the agreement between the government of Yemen and the Houthis on several measures to de-escalate tensions in relation to the banking sector and Yemeni airways. This is indeed a welcome development and a step in the right direction on the path to genuine and lasting peace in Yemen. However, despite this most welcome development, the A3+ expresses deep concern at the provocative actions, ongoing military operations and airstrikes, including against multiple locations in Yemen, particularly in the province of Hodeidah. We're extremely alarmed by the security situation in the Red Sea, with several attacks by the Houthis on shipping vessels having been recorded in June and reaching unprecedented levels since December. In this regard, we call on the Houthis to immediately cease all attacks which undermine the navigational rights and freedom, and as well as regional peace and security. We continue to call on the Houthis to respect and implement all resolutions of the Security Council, including Resolution 2216, that demands inter alia that the Houthis, and I quote, refrain from any provocation or threat to neighboring states, end of quote. We call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint to avoid further escalation. The use of force will only exacerbate the situation and risk undermining the efforts of the Special Envoy for Yemen to relaunch the political process. In this regard, a prompt response and diligent action are needed to address the wider conflict in the region, with the urgency of a ceasefire in Gaza, which cannot be overstated, as it remains key to the stability of the Middle East. Mr. President, the ongoing conflict and humanitarian crisis in Yemen, now in its 10th year, demand our urgent and unwavering attention. The severe hardships inflicted on the civilian population make Yemen one of the world's most dire humanitarian crises. More than 18 million people need aid, with 17 million facing severe food shortages. Half of the population lack access to drinking water, leading to cholera outbreaks and a severe malnutrition crisis, where nearly half of all children under 5 suffer from moderate stunting. We acknowledge the positive impact of the WFP's one-off food distribution in 8 districts in Hajj and Al-Hodeidah during May, which temporarily reduced severe food deprivation and reliance on severe food coping strategies. The crisis in Yemen requires a significant scaling up of humanitarian efforts. We urge UN agencies, donor countries, and international organizations to fully fund and mobilize resources for the 2024 Yemen Humanitarian Response Plan. Current international aid falls dismally short of addressing the immense suffering of the Yemeni people. The combined effects of conflict, economic instability, and climate change-induced drought and floods continue to devastate Yemen's agricultural infrastructure and livelihood, worsening the critical food and water crisis. The A3+ remains deeply concerned about the rights of women and girls, especially in Houthi-controlled areas, and calls for the lifting of restrictions on their freedom of movement and access to education and healthcare. Mr. President, the A3+ strongly condemns the arbitrary detention of UN staff members and aid workers by the Houthis. These actions are flagrant violations of international law and must be unequivocally condemned. We demand the immediate and unconditional release of all detainees and urge the Houthis to ensure the safety and security of humanitarian and UN personnel. We extend our gratitude to Oman for hosting the 9th meeting of the Supervisory Committee on the implementation of the detainees agreement and call on all parties to cooperate with the UN Special Envoy for Yemen to finalize the release plan for all conflict-related detainees as per the Stockholm Agreement following the all for all principle. The A3 Plus acknowledges Saudi Arabia's vital financial and political support for Yemen. We note, however, that the scale of the crisis demands a coordinated international response. We affirm our support for the Yemeni-led and owned peace process based on agreed references for political settlement. We fully support UN efforts, as well as regional and international initiatives towards a political resolution. In conclusion, we urge the international community to intensify efforts to secure a ceasefire in Yemen. We also demand that the parties guarantee unhindered humanitarian access to aid workers and uphold human rights and international humanitarian law. Diplomatic efforts must be intensified to bring all parties to the negotiating table in search of a peaceful solution. The people of Yemen need peace and cannot afford any further delays. I thank you.
I thank Sierra Leone for their statement, and I now give the floor to Switzerland. Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Special Envoy Hans Grunberg and Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Joyce Msuya, not only for their briefings, but also for their great commitment. This is our sanctuary. I now feel a sense of relief, said 60-year-old Aziza in 2023 after repairing her house in Aden with UNHCR support. In 2024, unfortunately, such testimonies are likely to be rarer. As we have heard on the political front, the situation in Yemen and the region is becoming increasingly volatile, and the utmost restraint is called for, and we all spoke out yesterday during the emergency meeting on the topic. Yesterday, on behalf of Switzerland, I would like to reiterate the call made by the Council in its Resolution 2739. We urge all parties to the conflict to redouble their diplomatic efforts and to favor dialogue over violence. At the same time, the progress made in discussions under the auspices of the United Nations must be preserved. Otherwise, there is a significant risk of a return to violence. In this respect, we welcome the agreement between the parties to allow banks to continue to operate, as well as the decision in principle to increase air traffic. We also thank the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for its engagement. This agreement is meant to be an important step towards creating the climate of trust necessary to give new momentum to the talks initiated by the Special Envoy. On the humanitarian front, the situation remains extremely worrying, as we have heard. Prolonged displacements, the economic crisis exacerbated by the party's economic retaliation measures, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, and the collapse of basic services are leading to a multifaceted humanitarian crisis, marked in particular by growing food insecurity and malnutrition. Half of Yemen's population, that is over 18 million people, are in need of emergency humanitarian aid. Recent figures show that 58% of Yemeni households do not have enough to eat. This is a hitherto unprecedented level, and the proportion of stunting among children is among the highest in the world. Families are forced to choose between feeding and educating their children. Dropping out of school, early marriages, and the recruitment of child soldiers are fueling tomorrow's crisis. The work of humanitarian actors in Yemen is key to breaking this spiral, yet they are under pressure on many fronts. On the one hand, as we have heard, the safety of humanitarian actors is not guaranteed. Switzerland strongly condemns the prolonged and arbitrary detention of humanitarian and UN personnel by the Houthis for 2 months now. We reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all those detained. As recalled in Resolution 2730, humanitarian personnel are protected by international humanitarian law. On the other hand, the work of humanitarian actors is being hampered as well, particularly in the south of the country, by access restrictions and other bureaucratic measures. Switzerland urges all parties to guarantee rapid and unhindered humanitarian access to civilian populations in need. Mr. President, Aziz's relief must not be a mere reprieve. We must all commit ourselves to making it a lasting one. This Council must remain mobilized and support the Special Envoy in his efforts to obtain an agreement between the parties to the conflict. Switzerland will continue its commitment in this direction. Thank you very much. I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I give the floor to Slovenia.
I also thank the Special Envoy Grunberg and Acting Coordinator Msuya for their briefings. I welcome the Yemeni ambassador to the meeting. I also welcome the recent renewal of the UNMA mandate. Following the drone attack in Tel Aviv, claimed by the Houthis last Friday, and subsequent Israeli strikes of targets in Yemen, we are concerned at the potential for the situation in Yemen to rapidly deteriorate. We call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, and we reaffirm our support for the UN-led peace process. President, it is almost 2 months since the arbitrary detention by the Houthis of 18 humanitarian workers from the UN and international NGO community, as well as many more from Yemeni NGOs and Yemeni civil society. As we have just heard from Special Envoy Grunberg and Coordinator Msuya, these individuals remain in detention today with no access and limited information about their well-being. This is a deeply troubling development. The fact that we have not had any positive movement on this since our last Council discussion is alarming. To the Houthis, we say directly, you cannot commit to protecting the well-being and dignity of the Palestinians suffering in Gaza while simultaneously denying the same rights to your own people in Yemen. You cannot claim to be a responsible player while simultaneously disregarding the basic principles of humanitarian action for a population that is reliant on humanitarian aid. We call for the immediate, safe and unconditional release of all those who have been arbitrarily detained by Houthis, and we call on all actors in Yemen to comply fully with their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law. President, the broader politicization and weaponization of the humanitarian and economic space in Yemen is a matter of great concern for Slovenia. We have heard on numerous occasions in this chamber that millions of Yemenis rely on humanitarian assistance daily, and we know that the country is heavily dependent on imports and remittances. For Yemenis, worsening food insecurity is sparking other crises. Crisis of protection and education, for example, which especially affect women and children. Therefore, we call for an end to disinformation and misinformation campaign, for an end to unilateral economic and banking measures, and for an end to Red Sea attacks, which are driving up costs and causing delays for humanitarian actors and importers. We urge dialogue between the parties with the envoy, and we therefore welcome today's announcement that an agreement was reached last night between the government of Yemen and the Houthis to de-escalate in relation to the banking sector and Yemen Airways. And President, in spite of the very challenging landscape, we have seen some other small chinks of light in recent weeks, with encouraging progress in Oman on the release of conflict-related detainees in the opening of additional roads for the first time in many years. These developments are incremental and hard-won. We acknowledge the efforts made by a variety of actors, from the Special Envoy's Office to the International Committee of the Red Cross, countries in the region, and crucially, by local mediators, in taking steps forward on the range of sensitive issues. We hope to see further progress on these issues in the near future. President, in conclusion, Slovenia hopes that the parties to the conflict in Yemen will abandon what the Special Envoy has described as zero-sum mindset. At a volatile time in the region, we call for all actors to avoid inflammatory and threatening statements and actions, and to engage constructively with the UN efforts towards finalizing a roadmap and reaching an inclusive intra-Yemeni process. A return to war will not serve the Yemeni people or the people of the region. I thank you.
I thank Slovenia for their statement and now give the floor to Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. I want to thank the briefings by Special Envoy Grunberg and Acting Coordinator Suya, and I welcome the representative of Yemen in this room. Mr. President, I will focus my statement on 4 points. First of all, my country continues to be very concerned about the violence provoked by the attacks of the Houthis against Israel. These attacks, together with continued hostilities in the Red Sea, are contrary to international law and have no justification. They threaten to erode the mediation opportunities to implement the roadmap. They also exacerbate the regional conflict and deepen the humanitarian crisis that the Yemeni people are suffering. It's urgent for the Security Council to maintain a unified position of condemning the attacks perpetrated by the Houthis and demand their immediate cessation. In addition, the Council must expedite the implementation of the arms embargo established pursuant to Resolution 2216. Secondly, I'd like to highlight the conclusion of the 9th meeting of the Supervisory Committee on the implementation of the detainees agreement, in which it was agreed to release Mohammed Katan and to hold a follow-up meeting to finalize the list of detainees to be freed. Ecuador would join the appeals for the parties to refrain from carrying out arbitrary detentions. I would like to reiterate our concern regarding the detention by the Houthis of humanitarian workers as well as the crew of the Galaxy Leader, which should be released immediately and unconditionally. Thirdly, and as warned by the Special Envoy Grunberg in his briefing, the banking sector of Yemen continues to be affected by the simultaneous operation of 2 monetary authorities. This situation leads to severe impact on the economy of Yemen and the purchasing power of people. This could only deepen food insecurity that already affects more than 2/3 of the population, of which approximately 2.4 million are children. Fourthly, Ecuador commends the intensification of efforts by humanitarian organizations to confront the outbreak of cholera, as well as the meeting held on the 14th of July between representatives of the UN and Yemeni officials in Aden to discuss the humanitarian challenges facing the country. Nevertheless, the humanitarian response plan has obtained less than 1/4 of the required amount. The financial support for humanitarian organizations is essential to address the urgent needs of the population. To conclude, and in spite of increase in tensions, Ecuador would like to reiterate that political intra-Yemeni dialogue under the aegis of the United Nations is the only path towards a sustainable peace in Yemen. This is where I'd like to reiterate our support for the work of Special Envoy Grunberg. Thank you very much.
I thank Ecuador for their statement. Now I'll give the floor to Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Special Envoy Grunberg and S. Jim Suya for their informative briefings and their dedicated work. 10 years into the conflict, the situations in and around Yemen remains highly complex and difficult, which is amplified by the alarming developments over the past few days. For today's meeting, let me focus on 4 points. First and foremost, as we stated yesterday, Japan would like to reiterate a strong condemnation of the recent drone attack on Tel Aviv by the Houthis. We are seriously concerned about the current situation and calls for no further escalation. The Houthis must immediately stop their threats and hostile rhetoric against Israel, which are further destabilizing the Middle East. Second, Japan unequivocally condemns that the Houthis have detained more than 10 personnel from UN agencies and INGOs and many others supporting humanitarian activities and deny any access to them for over a month. These detentions directly impede critical aid delivery in Houthis-controlled areas where the Yemeni people are suffering from dire shortage of food, medicine, and other basic human needs, as ASG Musuya has just stated. We demand that the Houthis immediately and unconditionally release not only those detained last month, but also other UN and diplomatic mission staff they have held in captivity for years. The Houthis must also stop their disinformation campaigns and other impediments to humanitarian aid workers who are working tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of Yemenis. Third, Japan is outraged by the ongoing Houthis attack in the Red Sea and surrounding waters. These persistent and ruthless attacks have killed innocent civilians, sunk commercial vessels, and disrupted global maritime transportation. Our indignation also extends to the Houthis for their continued detention of the 25 crew members of the Galaxy Reader for more than 8 months. Once again, the Houthis must immediately cease their threats to international shipping and unconditionally release the Galaxy Leader and its crew, consistent with the Council's resolutions 2722 and 2739. Fourth and lastly, Japan deeply regrets that the peace process has stagnated over a long time, while the resumption of negotiations on the release of prisoners, as well as the latest announcement that the government of Yemen and the Houthis agreed on several measures, are positive developments. We urge all parties concerned to create a conducive environment for peace talks under UN auspices. Japan continues to support the work of the Special Envoy towards lasting peace in Yemen. I thank you.
I thank Japan for their statement and now give the floor to China.
Thank you, President. I thank Special Envoy Grunberg and Acting Under-Secretary General Musuya for their briefings. I welcome the presence of the representative of Yemen at today's meeting. The settlement of the Yemeni question requires political and diplomatic means. China hopes that all parties concerned will stay the course of political solution, build consensus, meet each other halfway, jointly promote a Yemeni-led and owned comprehensive political process, and resolve tensions and differences through dialogue and negotiation. The international community should provide assistance and play a constructive role in this regard. Recently, thanks to the good offices of Special Envoy Grunberg, the Yemeni government and the Houthis held talks on prisoner exchange. Yesterday, with regard to financial and airline sectors, the Yemeni parties reached an agreement. China welcomes those positive developments. The ongoing tensions in the Red Sea are unsettling. We once again urge the Houthis to respect the right of navigation of commercial vessels under international law in the Red Sea, cease assaults, and maintain safe navigation in the Red Sea. At the same time, we also call on other relevant parties to maintain restraint and halt any actions that may exacerbate tensions. The humanitarian situation in Yemen remains grim. The international community should scale up humanitarian and development assistance to Yemen, support and help the people and government of Yemen to develop the country's economy and improve living conditions. China expresses its serious concern over the detention of UN personnel in Yemen. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all UN personnel. President, the tensions in the Red Sea are a somber manifestation of the spillover of the Gaza conflict. The recent attacks between the Houthis and Israel have led to more precarious escalation. China calls for the full and effective implementation of the Security Council's relevant resolutions on Yemen and the promotion of an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. All parties should exercise restraint, avoid further escalation, and prevent plunging the entire region into an even greater catastrophe. China stays committed to working with the international community and making unremitting efforts for the political settlement of the Yemeni question and maintenance of peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China, and I now give the floor to France.
Merci.
Thank you. I thank Hans Grunberg and Joyce Msuya for their briefings. I would also like to welcome the presence here of the permanent representative of Yemen. Mr. President, as we have stressed yesterday, Houthis must immediately cease their destabilizing activities in the region. These are unacceptable. France reiterates our strong condemnation of the drone attack which targeted Tel Aviv on the night of from the 18th to the 19th of July, claimed by the Houthis. We'd like to address our condolences to the relatives of the victims and express our support for the wounded. Houthis, supported by the Islamic Republic of Iran, must immediately cease their attacks that fuel regional escalation, including in the Red Sea and in the Gulf of Aden. This Council has condemned these attacks, in particular by adopting Resolution 2622 and 2739. States have the right to defend their ships against these attacks in accordance with international law. By these actions, Houthis bear a heavy responsibility for regional escalation. We call on the Houthis to put an end to these and immediately release the Galaxy leader and its crew, which have been detained since November of 2023. France will continue its involvement in the framework of the European Operation Aspides to ensure maritime security and the freedom of navigation in conformity with international law and in coordination with its partners. Houthis have irresponsible conduct, which also has disastrous consequences for the people of Yemen. They are leading an economic war against a legitimate government and are diverting humanitarian aid in the area under their control. In June, Houthis conducted unprecedented arbitrary arrests against workers of the United Nations and local and international NGOs. France strongly condemns this and demands their release. These actions are very serious and hinder the action of the organizations on the ground. They face numerous restrictions imposed on the territory controlled by Houthis and at the expense of the local population. Women are particularly targeted by these restrictions. It is unacceptable that the World Food Programme was forced by the Houthis to suspend their activities which are meant to cover the urgent needs of the civilian population. Houthis must cease to commit abuses against their own population that they are suffocating economically and threaten on a daily basis. We must think together with the UN agencies on the means of providing humanitarian assistance to civilians in areas controlled by Houthis. Humanitarian personnel must be able to conduct their operations in a secure and unhindered way. Mr. President, and at the security level, we must achieve a complete cessation, a lasting cessation of hostilities to avoid any resumption of conflict on the ground. Houthis must stop sabotaging the efforts of the Special Envoy, to which France expressed its full support in implementing the roadmap. Effective participation of Yemeni women in negotiations must be ensured. Thank you.
I thank France for their statement, and I give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Special Envoy Grunberg and Acting USG Masuya, for your briefings. The United States shares your assessment that the Houthis' actions in Yemen and the region are increasingly challenging peace and stability. Special Envoy Grunberg, my delegation is hopeful that any agreement by the parties reached will result in true de-escalation on the part of the Houthis. Yemenis need the support of the international community, and yet the Houthis continue taking steps that make it more difficult. As we discussed yesterday, the Houthis have launched approximately 200 missiles and drones towards Israel in recent months with no regard for civilian lives. The Houthis' July 19 drone strike in the heart of Tel Aviv, using what appears to be an Iranian-made Samad 3 UAV, is just another case of the Houthis flouting the demands of this council to cease attacks and Iran violating the UN arms embargo. Turning to the recently detained humanitarian personnel, we repeat our call for the immediate release and condemn the Houthi actions. Sadly, this is not the first instance in which the Houthis detained international personnel, foreign nationals, and religious minorities. the Houthis have detained without justification U.S. local staff for more than 2.5 years, 4 UN staff for over 2 years, and 25 crewmen from the Galaxy Leader for over 8 months. 4 Yemeni Bahia also remain in detention after more than 1 year. We reject the notion that the Houthis should be given time to conduct so-called investigations before releasing people that have been illegally detained. The Houthis are not a government and have no capacity to investigate anything. Their efforts to use disinformation to distract from their own failures reflect the blatant disregard they have for the Yemeni people. At this time, we believe that the UN and international community cannot continue business as usual. We believe it is time that the Security Council speak with one voice and demand the immediate and safe release of all detained Yemeni personnel from the United Nations, national and international non-governmental organizations, diplomatic missions, and civil society, all of whom were working to improve the lives of the Yemeni people by bringing life-saving assistance to their country at the time of their detention. The facts are known, and the Secretary General has been clear about what the Houthis must do. It is time that we support his call for their immediate and unconditional release. We must support the UN agencies operating in Yemen as they determine the necessary next steps to protect their personnel in light of the deteriorating security environment. We must also come together to demand that the Houthis cease their reckless attacks in the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, and surrounding waterways in violation of Resolution 2722. The Houthis' increasingly brazen and opportunistic attacks call into question their intention to abide by a future UN roadmap for peace. Colleagues, the Houthis and their Iranian sponsors are responsible for jeopardizing a political resolution of Yemen's conflict. We must keep up international pressure on them. We must also take steps to deny the Houthis the weapons and supplies, particularly the critical materiel they have long received from Iran in contravention of the UN arms embargo established in Resolution 2216. We were pleased that UNMAHA's mandate was extended last month, allowing it to continue ceasefire monitoring patrols in the Red Sea off the coast of Yemen. We once again call for the strengthening of UNVIM and urge more countries to step up and provide financial assistance to support this critical mandate. It is unacceptable that numerous vessels have docked at Houthi-controlled ports without inspection in the past year. Violators of the arms embargo should know that this Council is determined to enforce its resolutions and to impose costs for supplying arms to the Houthis. As members of the international community, we must also redouble efforts to stop the illicit smuggling of weapons. Yemen has long deserved a better future, and we were hopeful just a year ago this country would begin to see it. This goal remains elusive, and the path to peace and prosperity is now at risk because of Houthi actions. Thank you.
I now give the floor to Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank Special Envoy Grunberg and Acting USG Masuya for their briefings. As emphasized yesterday, Malta remains deeply concerned about the escalations posed by the recent developments. We firmly condemn the Houthi-claimed drone attack on Tel Aviv of 19 July and call on the Houthis to immediately cease all attacks. We similarly call on them to cease their attacks against commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The retaliatory airstrikes by Israel in and around the port of Hodeidah left many victims and casualties whilst causing considerable damage to civilian infrastructure. This is concerning. We once again underscore that all parties are obliged to protect civilians under international law. Hodeidah port is a lifeline for millions of people in Yemen who rely heavily on imports of essential items such as food, medicine, and fuel. It is critical for the port to be open and operating. Moreover, Hodeidah port is in a densely populated urban center where thousands of people live. any military campaign in its vicinity risks having devastating consequences for civilians. Ongoing military action in the region risks disrupting ongoing mediation efforts. They hamper progress towards a formal nationwide ceasefire and a broader political solution to the conflict in Yemen. The resumption of an inclusive, Yemeni-led and owned political process with the full, equal, meaningful and safe participation of women remains key. Given the risks of broader conflict in the Middle East, it is essential for all parties to exercise restraint, to de-escalate and to pursue peaceful solutions to all disputes. Malta condemns the arrests and arbitrary detentions conducted by the Houthis of UN personnel, civil society and staff working for non-governmental organizations and diplomatic missions in Yemen. These individuals must be immediately and unconditionally released. All parties to the conflict must fully comply with their obligations under international law and international humanitarian law, including the prohibition against the arbitrary deprivation of liberty. This situation is having far-reaching ramifications on the delivery of humanitarian aid into and throughout Yemen, at a time when the country suffers heightened levels of food insecurity. We call on all parties to ensure unimpeded and timely humanitarian access to those in need, as well as a safe operating environment for humanitarian actors. We further call on the international community to support a robust response to Yemen's humanitarian crisis and urgently scale up funding for Yemen's humanitarian response plan. President, Malta welcomes the convening of the Supervisory Committee on the implementation of the detainees agreement. We call on parties to continue to engage on this matter to fulfill their commitment to the Stockholm Agreement to release all conflict-related detainees and those arbitrarily detained. We also welcome the Council's recent renewal of UNMHA, UNMA, which performs crucial work supporting the Hodeidah Agreement. The economic war that has been conducted by parties to the conflict has fragmented and destabilized Yemen's economy and currency. Such actions have caused inflation to rise and surging the prices of essential goods, serving as a major driver of suffering. We are all pleased with the announcement last night that the government of Yemen and the Houthis agreed on several measures to de-escalate in relation to the banking sector and Yemeni Airways. We echo the Special Envoy for the need for the parties to collaborate towards an economy that benefits all Yemenis and supports the implementation of a nationwide ceasefire and the resumption of an inclusive political process. In conclusion, President, Malta is deeply concerned by the political, humanitarian and economic situation in Yemen. We urge parties to constructively engage with the Office of the Special Envoy on commitments made to the UN roadmap. We echo the Secretary-General in expressing our deep appreciation for the invaluable work done by UN personnel and partners to try to alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people. I thank you.
I thank Malta for your statement, and I give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Special Envoy Hans Grunberg and Acting USG Joy Sumsuya for the informative updates. I also welcome the participation of the representative of Yemen. As I said yesterday, the Middle East remains in danger of conflict escalation. Now, the situation in and around Yemen is further deteriorating as we continuously witness the Houthis' dangerous actions. In this regard, the Republic of Korea once again strongly condemns the Houthis' drone attack on Tel Aviv, as well as their ongoing attacks on vessels in Red Sea and the broader region. We call on Houthis to immediately cease all such illegal and reckless activities, which only complicate the strenuous efforts toward peaceful political settlement in Yemen. In addition, we demand the immediate and unconditional release of all detainees, including UN, international and national NGOs, and diplomatic personnel. Arbitrary detentions are simply unacceptable under any circumstances. We also strongly urge the Houthis to ensure the safety of all detainees and provide access to their families, as holding them incommunicado with no due process amounts to enforced disappearances. Mr. President, the Republic of Korea expresses grave concerns over the deteriorating economic conditions in Yemen. The Houthis' hostile economic measures, followed by countermeasures from the Yemeni government, are exacerbating the liquidity crisis. As the USGMCR described in detail, the potential banking and financial sector crisis, coupled with ongoing currency depreciation and decreased purchasing power, could further restrict the Yemeni people's access to vital commodities such as food, fuel, and medicine. In the medium and long term, this tit-for-tat escalation would pose an increased risk of heightened food insecurity and hunger for Yemeni people, disproportionately impacting women and children. In this regard, we welcome the financial de-escalation deal between the Yemeni government and Houthis, which was just announced this morning. We hope that both parties will live up to their commitments for all Yemeni people. Despite this positive development, taking into account the dire humanitarian situation on the ground, we still believe the international community must refocus its sustained attention on the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Yemen. The Korean government has continuously delivered humanitarian assistance to the people in need in Yemen to enhance food and nutritional security. At the pledging event for the humanitarian crisis in Yemen last year, we announced our humanitarian aid amounting to $18.5 million, including in-kind contributions of rice. We will continue our active contributions to support Yemen's humanitarian needs this year as well. Achieving economic stability across Yemen is crucial for realizing a peaceful political transition and comprehensively addressing the dire humanitarian situation. In this context, we reaffirm our unwavering support for Special Envoy Grunberg's tireless efforts in tackling these ongoing challenges through his continuous engagement on the ground, both on political and economic fronts, and in advancement of an inclusive Yemeni-led political transition under UN auspices. It is imperative for all Yemeni parties, especially the Houthis, to commit to a faithful negotiation process and lay the groundwork for a concrete and sustainable political settlement to forge a brighter future for the Yemeni people. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement, and I now will make a statement in my capacity as representative of the Russian Federation.
We thank Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Hans Grunberg, and the Acting Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Joyce Msuya, for their briefings on the political and humanitarian situation in the country. We are gravely concerned by the current situation in Yemen, particularly its humanitarian aspects. According to UN estimates, more than 18 million people, or 2/3 of the country's population, are in need of some form of humanitarian assistance. The armed conflict, albeit relatively low intensity, and the resulting economic instability have placed a heavy burden on ordinary citizens. The most significant impact has been on the agricultural and food sector, which could have kept the situation afloat in one way or another. Food prices have risen so much that they have become inaccessible to the most vulnerable groups. There is an ongoing major funding shortfall for humanitarian programs. This year, only 23% of the UN response plan needs have been mobilized. As the Yemeni settlement process continues to be in a deadlock for the last 6 months, the situation on the ground is also rapidly deteriorating. The number of clashes along the contact line continues to grow. The nature of the incidents remains local for now, but we see this trend as a potentially explosive one. It is easy to miss the point when the point of no return has been crossed and Yemeni stakeholders gradually move away from a constructive approach aimed at developing acceptable normalization parameters, a resumption of a lasting and comprehensive ceasefire, and moving to a full-fledged political process in the country. It is extremely important to continue active and inclusive political and diplomatic efforts with all parties to the Yemeni conflict. We are prepared to continue providing the necessary assistance to Special Envoy Greenberg in this regard, maintaining close contact with them and encouraging restraint and a reaching of agreements. We believe it is also important to continue the practice of small steps aimed at overcoming mistrust between the parties. This will include the need to update the international legal parameters for the settlement so that they reflect realities on the ground. The situation in Yemen is exacerbated by the ongoing turbulence in the Middle East as a whole, which is experiencing these shocks due to the unprecedented brutality of Israel's actions in Gaza. Last week, we witnessed a Houthi attack on Tel Aviv and an Israeli retaliatory strike on Hodeidah. During the Council's discussion of this issue yesterday, we witnessed the selective blindness of our colleagues who persistently tried to ignore the elephant in the room. While there is no justification for such actions on the part of Ansar Allah, nor their attacks on commercial vessels in the Red Sea, one cannot ignore the fact that the primary and main reason for the spillover of the Yemeni crisis beyond the borders of that country is the ongoing slaughter in Gaza, which has already claimed nearly 40,000 innocent Palestinian lives. We consistently and unfailingly support the establishment of an immediate, unconditional, and comprehensive ceasefire in the sector, the release of hostages and detained Palestinians. Ending the violence in Gaza will allow the region to breathe a sigh of relief and lay the foundations for a transition to a long-lasting peace and stability. In our view, this cause and effect relationship is absolutely clear, and denying it is pointless. Yemen will finally be able to focus on its domestic agenda, resolve existing political differences, and move to redressing the dire humanitarian situation in the country. The support of the international community is a key factor for Yemen and the Yemeni people in these conditions. But some states, instead of working on calming the situation, are trying to put out the fire with fuel and prioritizing the use of force. This applies first and foremost to the situation in the Red Sea, where the so-called coalition led by the US and the UK is carrying out open aggression against Yemen. And even though attacks on the territory of the sovereign Middle Eastern country have been ongoing for nearly 6 months, they have had no impact whatsoever on the military capabilities of the Houthis, as we have clearly seen with their attack on Tel Aviv. Moreover, they have had the opposite effect. The credibility of the movement's in the region has been strengthened, and the intensity of strikes against commercial vessels has increased. Was this the goal that the US and their allies were pursuing? Russia decisively rejects the use of force to influence the Yemeni parties. At the same time, we consistently advocate the need to ensure the safety and security of international navigation and condemn any actions that threaten the safety of ships. We call in particular for the release of the MV Galaxy Leader and its crew. At the same time, we are convinced that the path towards de-escalation in the Red Sea includes ending the violence in Gaza and promoting an intra-Yemeni settlement, especially given that both of these goals are stipulated in the decisions of the Security Council. We once again urge our Western colleagues to focus on the implementation of these goals rather than digging themselves deeper into futile military escapades, which only serve to rapidly weaken your credibility in the region, which has already been undermined by your blind support for Israel. I now resume my function as the President of the Council, and I give the floor to Yemen.
Mr. President, allow me first to congratulate you on your presidency of this Council during the current month, and I wish you success. I thank your predecessor, the Permanent Representative of the Republic of Korea. I thank him for his presidency of the Council last month. I would also like to thank Madame Masuya and Mr. Grunberg for their briefings. Mr. President, the government of Yemen strongly condemns the Israeli aggression and Israel's violation of the sovereignty of Yemeni territory in a blatant violation of the United Nations Charter and international law and all international norms and regulations. We hold Israel fully responsible for any repercussions that result from their aerial strikes. We warn the terrorist Houthi militias of the dangers of continuing to hold hostage Yemen and its peoples and dragging them into its futile battles to serve the interests of the Iranian regime and its expansionist project in the region. Moreover, we warn Iran and Israel of any attempt to transform the Yemeni territories through rogue militias into a battlefield for their wars and their destructive projects in the region. We call upon this esteemed Council and the international community to shoulder their responsibilities to protect and preserve international peace and security, because the only path to this goal comes through supporting the Yemeni government in its efforts to establish its control over all Yemeni territory and to implement international legitimacy resolutions, especially Resolution 2216. Mr. President, the government of Yemen renews its commitment to a peace approach and its continued support to international and regional efforts, especially the intensive mediation efforts being made by our brethren in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Sultanate of Amman, and the efforts made by the Special Envoy of the United Nations Secretary General, all of which aim to achieve a just and comprehensive peace that is built on the terms of reference of the agreed-upon political solution, namely the GCC initiative, its implementation mechanism, the outcome of the Comprehensive National Dialogue Conference, and relevant United Nations resolutions, especially 2216. We call upon the Houthi militias to stop importing external interference and to stop their destructive approach and all forms of military violence and escalations, and to stop their persistent effort to abort peace efforts and to prolong the war in Yemen and the region and jeopardize international peace and security. We warn the Houthi militias of the dangers of returning to a comprehensive escalation choice and returning matters to square one. This would only multiply human suffering that has existed for too long. It would destroy what remains of the basic necessities of life and scarce livelihoods of the Yemeni people. It would waste international and regional efforts seeking to end the war and resume the path of peace, stability, and development. Mr. President, the Houthi militias continue to perpetrate violations against humanitarian and relief work in the areas under its control. The most recent of these examples is the detention and kidnapping of dozens of employees of the United Nations agencies and international and national NGOs working in Yemen. These include men and women who were kidnapped from their homes, had their properties looted, and their families terrorized. They were forcibly disappeared, and their fate hasn't been disclosed yet, despite more than a month passing since that incident. And this is a great violation of international law and international humanitarian law and a direct threat to the life and safety of these personnel. We warn of the dangers of turning a blind eye to these violations and through which the Houthi militias seek to serve their political agenda and to utilize humanitarian aid to serve their security and military goals, transforming the areas under their control into a prison to all those who oppose its policies. We renew our call to move United Nations offices and the offices of international organizations to the temporary capital, Aden, so as to lighten the pressure imposed by these militias on the work of these organizations and offer a suitable and sound environment for these agencies to practice to perform their duties away from any interferences and with no obstacles or constraints so that humanitarian aid can be delivered to those who need it and who are the most vulnerable. I regret to say that it is our judgment that the measures taken by United Nations offices in Yemen to protect their personnel and save their lives have not been of the level required or even expected to this day, and do not rise to the level of the danger that threatens their lives and freedom. We call upon this Council and the United Nations to exert pressure on the Houthi militias to take urgent measures to guarantee the safety of humanitarian workers and release hostages and detainees with no conditions. Mr. President, the terrorists Houthi, the Houthi militias, and since the 25th of June continue to hold 4 out of the 7 airplanes belonging to the Yemen-USA-Airlines fleet along with their crews. This is added to the obstacles and violations perpetrated by the militias against the Yemen-USA Airlines, the national carrier of passengers to and from Yemen, since flights were resumed to and from Sanaa airport. The terrorist Houthi militias continue to freeze the company's accounts, totaling over $100 million since March 2023. As a result of these violations and these practices by the Houthis against the national airline, the Yemeni Airlines insurance company, Access Specialty Limited, has informed us that it will cancel the operation of flights to and from airports operated by the Houthi militias and through the airspace under the control, because the geographic and airspace in areas of under Houthi control is considered high risk from an insurance perspective and is a threat to passenger and aviation safety. And should flights be resumed and operated, then the liability coverage for the company will be altered from 100% to 81%. This will impose additional losses and burdens on the Yemeni Airlines in a manner that would make it unable to survive. And this would disable Yemenis and would not allow them to travel to and from Yemen, and this would further exacerbate economic burdens and the humanitarian crisis. You realize that this current problem with Yemeni Airlines is one of the repercussions of resuming flights to and from Sanaa Airport as an element of the humanitarian ceasefire sponsored by the United Nations since April 2022. And therefore, we call upon your esteemed Council to undertake its responsibilities and take the necessary measures to make the militia Houthis abide by ending these practices and violations, and to immediately release the airplanes and their technical crews and the frozen funds, so that we would prevent a stop to the flights operated by the national carrier to and from Yemen and exacerbate the suffering of Yemenis. The coup that the Houthi militias have launched against the Yemeni state and the outcomes of the Comprehensive National Dialogue Conference and the aspirations of the Yemeni people for security, stability, and development has created a disastrous economic and humanitarian situation and has pushed millions of Yemenis under the poverty line and into the arms of hunger. It has destroyed the infrastructure and killed hundreds of thousands of them, and exacerbated internal displacement, producing 4.5 million IDPs. Yemen has lost approximately 23 years of development gains, and 80% of its population are no longer receiving basic social services. Our GDP has shrunk by half almost, and our economy has lost over $126 billion in the least estimates, and the production and exporting of oil has stopped because of the Houthi attacks on oil installations and oil exporting ports. This has deprived the Yemeni government and people of their most important resources and main sources of income. And faced with this catastrophic scene, Mr. President, the Yemeni government is working on resuming the reforms in the fields of the economy, finance, and government services to confront these challenges and improve livelihoods and contain the deterioration of the national currency and regulate spending. We also aim to support the decisions of the Yemeni Central Bank that aim to protect the banking sector and end fiscal distortions, as well as enhance oversight on banks and their external transactions. We also support the bank as it seeks to respond to the requirements of disclosure and the requirements of combating money laundering and financing of terrorism. Moreover, there are options available to make some progress, especially in light of the support given by regional and international partners within the framework of a comprehensive program for economic recovery, reconstruction, and SDGs. The Yemeni government welcomes the announcement by the Special Envoy on cancelling recent decisions against certain banks and the banking sector and the resumption of air flights through Sanaa airport and sending them to other destinations as needed. At the same time, we believe that this initiative is a way to alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people. And we hope that this agreement would provide the necessary conditions to establish a constructive debate to end all of the Houthis' destructive efforts, destructive measures against the banking sector, the economy, the national currency, and would push them to fulfill their obligations towards the roadmap, especially the resumption of oil exports. In closing, we express our extreme regrets over the stalled negotiations on the prisoner and detainees file recently held in the